Hi friends, welcome to this week's episode of Foresight. In this episode, we're going to talk about this week's event in the United States and quite specifically the storming of the US Capitol by supporters of President Trump and what led to this. In particular, the role of social media and what did social media do in order to make this happen. We're going to talk about the impact of social media on our lives, the role of big tech, especially Facebook and Twitter, on changing human behavior, and if these companies should be held responsible to some extent and accountable for what has happened in the United States. You're watching Foresight, and my name is Ian Khan. This week has been an unprecedented week in the United States. In fact, it has been a global event that has transpired in Washington, D.C. this week. Hundreds of protesters and supporters of President Trump stormed the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, and took over for a few hours. One person was fatally shot, and there have been a total of 4 deaths, including that of a policeman on site. Dozens have been arrested. Now, in Foresight, we're not going to analyze the politics of how this happened, but we're going to look at the role of technology in making this happen and what role did technology play. The last time people stormed the Capitol was about 150 years ago, and since then this has never happened. This event is unprecedented and more than just an attack on democracy and the institution that the US Capitol is. It is an attack on what the US stands for, and that's why this is important. This information is not new, that President Trump has been a big user of Twitter, and it's common knowledge that he makes his views known on Twitter and social media, whether it's amplifying his message or suggesting something, or suggesting in recent times that the election was rigged and there was something fraudulent happening in terms of voting. He said many things on his Twitter account. Right after the elections, Facebook saw the rise of many different groups that were trying to echo his words, and these conversations have been happening for months. The word "Stop the Steal" echoed across Facebook in different groups that have supported President Trump in this last election. Now, Facebook removed many of those groups, but the initial damage had already been done. When the roots of conspiracy are so deep that it's difficult to remove them, you cannot just expect everything to go smoothly. And this event at the US Capitol is the final culmination of that. Undoubtedly, the biggest role that Facebook and other social media have played, including Twitter, is disinformation. And this information has been a big problem within the US, spreading wrong and falsified information. The question becomes, who can you hold responsible for inciting the speech of hatred, the speech of disinformation, the speech of inaccuracy and hatred and racism? Today, in the era we live in, undoubtedly the internet has a lot to do with how we understand the world around us. And of course, there's traditional media, newspaper, television, and so on. But there's also user-generated content where people are generating news, people are generating buzz, and doing things like we've never been able to do. This is the power of technology. This is the power of social media happening right now. Now, post these events this week, the world is waking up to the idea that social media has failed the law. Social media has really changed the face of the world and the way we think and affects us. And how do we need to, do we really need to maybe reconsider social media and its impact on us? Does this mean more regulation on social media, more control on what social media cracks down on, what implications content has? What about things such as freedom of speech, freedom of information? Right after the events at the Capitol in DC this week, Facebook and Twitter both jumped up and said they would be limiting President Trump's messages and actually blocked his accounts so that he couldn't post on any of these platforms. Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, subsequently announced that Facebook would be banning President Trump's access to Facebook at least until the new president, President Joe Biden, was sworn in. And seeing that what the risk of having President Trump put messages on Facebook and Twitter are, this is what it has come to. Mark Zuckerberg also said that, and this is somewhat the kind of message of the year, that social media platforms have so much power that they can quiet and somebody can get people to voice their opinion. And this is somewhat the kind of message of the year, that social media platforms have so much power that they can quiet somebody and they can quieten people, but they can also get people to voice their opinion. They can stop certain groups of people from talking on their platforms. And so this just goes to show how much power social media platforms hold, and how much power does Mark Zuckerberg have, or how much power does Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, have? How much power do tech giants, including Amazon, Microsoft, and so many other companies that are beyond comprehension. In fact, Twitter also suspended President Trump's account. This has really raised red flags as to what can be used to incite hatred or incite speech. Does this mean that any of us can go online and talk about things and talk about whatever we can to do to destroy communities, maybe create violence? Who decides when somebody should be stopped? If it's really the CEOs of social platforms, then something is really wrong. YouTube, in the meanwhile, has also taken down President Trump's video in which he falsely claims that the election was stolen, and that YouTube would impose suspensions against users and ban users who violate policies of YouTube and talk about election fraud claims and so on. Now, YouTube is owned by Google, and that's how Google now gets involved in this. Google has also come under scrutiny in the past for biasing its search results, and there's a whole antitrust side of things, antitrust litigation that's taking place against Facebook, Google, Amazon, and many other big tech companies, which I've covered in one of the past episodes. Perhaps one of the biggest problems is that we need to realize, and people need to understand, that what happens online and what happens offline are very similar. The world, we kind of live in two different mindsets, online and offline. This is one world we live in. And this is happening right now. The problem is there are laws and regulations that have been issued in the past. For example, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in the US, which stops platforms from liability that their users post information. And this is an open loophole. It's something that Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg can just not be affected by because of this law. Now, there's likely going to be a huge reform with Section 230 and holding platform providers responsible for what their platforms are used for, so that will be really good news. In addition to the riots this week, there's been many cases of shootings and events that have happened because of the use of social media, and where social media was used to. We perhaps need to rethink again that, is it just President Trump? Is it just his supporters and followers who need to be blamed for the riots and the storming of the Capitol in DC? What about the social media companies that include Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube, Twitter? Aren't they responsible for creating the breeding ground for people with conspiracy theory mindsets and ideologies, dangerous criminals who conduct underground groups that breed violence? Shouldn't we consider these people should be held responsible? This hasn't been the first time it's happened. It's happened many times in the past. For example, Pizzagate conspiracy. President Obama warning Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg that election meddling will take place. Cambridge Analytica, and that happened. The question becomes, why did it take so long for these large, extra, big social media companies to flag content, to suspend President Trump's account, and to recognize the destructive power of social media platforms, destructive power of what they can do and what their users can do? Now, the question is, how can big tech step up, behave responsibility, or take responsibility and acknowledge that they need to fix things and curb on identifying hate speech, identify elements that are far right, make sure that society is a safer place because of them, and that they're able to cut down on activities and eliminate things that are a harm to society. But here's another side of social media. Now, people who stormed the US Capitol are now being identified through social media, and many of them are losing their jobs, and this is unprecedented. I love it. Many companies have been coming forth and said they spotted their employee at the riots, and now they're firing their employee, and so on and so forth. And people have come forward, identified other people, and said, hey, this person was there, and they're being either suspended. And there's been many cases of that in the last day or so. In Pennsylvania, a teacher has been relieved of his duties until it's completely investigated that what was he doing there. A Texas lawyer has been barred from his job because he was at the protests. And so this has taken a better turn, and maybe the same platforms that have given people and set people loose and given them the opportunity to be miscreants, but now we're looking at cracking down on these people. And this is terrible. Like, this is such a messy affair. First, you incite hatred and war and crises and chaos, and then next you just crack down on these people. 4 people died as a result of these attacks on the US Capitol. And who should be made responsible? President Trump, social media companies, people who created these groups and these posts, Facebook, Twitter, Google, their CEOs should be sent to jail. Who is it, is the big question. This is the biggest question that perhaps these riots are getting us to ask. My final comments and my final words are that technology has become very pervasive in our lives. It's everywhere. It's on your phone, it's on your television, it's on your tablet, your computer. We're glued to content. We're sucked into content because of how it is designed, how it is gamified, how it is positioned, and how algorithms specifically craft content for you, and how algorithms specifically hook you on to content. And there you are watching videos back to back for hours and hours until you don't realize that you've been sitting there for hours and hours watching some content. And so the design of social media is a very strategic thing that social media companies do. They just don't build software and platforms and off you go using it. No, there's a lot of psychology, there's a lot of user behavior behind every single button that you see on Facebook. The placement of the buttons, the placement of the like button, the I don't like button, sharing button, everything is strategized and thought about by countless number of people in Facebook and teams in Twitter and all these social platforms. It's highly unlikely that these companies are going to shut down. It's highly unlikely that Facebook will change overnight, and Twitter will change overnight, and Google will change overnight. And that's the reason why these antitrust lawsuits are happening. And some of it is in my past videos on Foresight. You can watch what I'm talking about. But antitrust litigation is just one small part of what companies are becoming and how legislators want to limit their power and their growth. But it doesn't mean that they're changing the design of how the algorithm is designed. That's got nothing to do with antitrust. So we need to start thinking about how can there be regulation in getting companies such as Facebook and Twitter and whoever else to design their software, design their algorithm, design their decision-making technology in a specific way so that it's not harmful. And that's the bigger challenge. Rather than breaking down these companies into smaller pieces, they'll still end up doing what they want to do. They'll still end up doing the things that they will make them a profit. And that's the bigger question, folks. This is Foresight. My name is Ian Khan, and it's been a pleasure hosting this episode because the events have been dramatic. They've been just mind openers to everyone about what technology can make happen. And this is not just the technology side of the picture. There's a political event. It's a big thing in the U.S. which has gone through a really tough time over the past few years. Last year as well, with protests and different issues coming up in the U.S. society. So hope for the best, and let's hope that we're able to see a better future and make better decisions. You take care. Thanks for watching. Until next time, this is Ian Khan.